The last thing that General Conrad von Hötzendorf wanted was to find himself fighting a war on two fronts. But here he is, commanding what's left of the Austro-Hungarian army, having just suffered defeat at the hands of the Serbian army. He watches anxiously as the retreating Austrians fall back on Belgrade, hoping that they can make it to the city before the Serbians arrive and finish them off. But what Conrad doesn't know is that his problems are only just beginning. Welcome to another episode of our World War I Serbia campaign series. Today, we're going to talk about the Battle of Sir and its consequences. WLC, how Serbia almost manages to destroy the Austro-Hungarian army, and why Austria ended up fighting the remainder of the war with an entirely new force. As we talked about in our last episode, the battles of Caronsebeș and Point George Marca were indecisive affairs. Despite being victorious at both of these engagements, the Serbian commander, General Putnik, failed to press his advantage and destroy the enemy. As we discussed then, this was due to several factors. First, the Serbs lacked heavy weapons and guns to bring artillery fire down on the disorganized Austrian infantry. Second, there was a miscommunication between the two Serbian Corps commanders. And finally, there was no trained cavalry force available to exploit breaks in the lines. What this meant was that when the Serbs had the opportunity to inflict a devastating blow on the Austro-Hungarian army, they failed to do so and instead allowed it to slip through their fingers. The reason why this failure was critical would soon become apparent. In order to get the ball rolling again, the Allies met together in a council of war after the inconclusive Battle of Caronsebeș. It was decided that the French Colonel de Brossa would lead a small force to capture the town of Negetin, while the rest of the Serbian forces advanced westwards towards the retreating Austrians. However, as we saw in our last video, this plan didn't work out either. Not only did the Austrians manage to stabilize their front line, but the French column at Negetin also came under attack by another Austrian force trying to relieve the pressure on their comrades further south. As the French struggled to hold their positions against repeated attacks, the Serbs realized that something had to be done or their hard-won gains would be lost. So General Putnik ordered the Second Army to stop their advance and instead come to the aid of their hard-pressed comrades further north. This relief force was led by General Victor Kohan, who set out with around 28,000 men to rescue the beleaguered French. But upon arriving at the battlefield, he found that the situation was even worse than he feared. Not only was the French force nearly annihilated, but the Austrian army had rallied and was now advancing forward. At this point, the only option open to Kohan was to throw his men into the fray immediately and try to stop the Austrian advance. And so he did, throwing his forces into battle around the village of Sir, which soon became known simply as the Battle of Sir. The fighting was brutal. Kohan's men fought bitterly to hold their positions, but the Austro-Hungarian troops pressed home their attack with unrelenting ferocity. For days, the Serbian defenders held firm, inflicting heavy casualties on the attacking Austrians. But they were gradually forced back into a smaller and smaller pocket around the village. On August 16, 1914, realizing that victory was within reach, Conrad von Hötzendorf ordered one final push to break through the Serbian lines and destroy the enemy. This time, the Austro-Hungarians managed to succeed where they had failed so many times before. Serbian resistance began to crumble, and the Battle of Sir became a rout. Within a few hours, General Kohan's entire force of 28,000 men had been defeated and forced to flee across the Sir and Timok rivers into the hills to the east. What followed was probably one of the most impressive feats of arms in the entire war. With their army in full flight, the Serbs retreated through rugged mountainous terrain, harassed all the way by Austrian cavalry. Yet, despite being attacked repeatedly, they managed to regroup and escape to safety, leaving behind only 1,000 men captured or dead. Astonishingly, General Conrad von Hötzendorf had managed to completely break the Serbian army, except he hadn't. You see, while he had inflicted a crushing defeat on the Serbian field army, he had not managed to stop their territorial gains. In fact, Serbia now controlled the entire valley of the Danube from the city of Belgrade down to the Romanian border. The Austro-Hungarian army, on the other hand, had suffered severe losses and had been pushed back to the defensive. Their army was demoralized, exhausted and in desperate need of supplies. They had also lost valuable territory, including the strategic railway hub of Negatin. To make matters worse, the remaining serviceable rifles in the army had now been distributed to hastily raised replacement battalions. Faced with this sorry state of affairs, Conrad von Hötzendorf knew that he could not continue the war with his depleted and demoralized force. He desperately needed reinforcements, and so he asked the Germans if they could spare an army to help prop up his collapsing force. And so it was that the Austro-Hungarian army was saved from total collapse by German Kaiser Wilhelm II, who spared the 7th Army to help prop up the collapsing Austro-Hungarian army. Under the command of General von Bommel, this force made up of 4 infantry divisions and 3 cavalry divisions was dispatched east to bolster Austro-Hungarian ranks. While not a significant force in terms of World War I standards, this intervention did prevent an outright collapse of the dual monarchy's forces. The 7th Army occupied key positions along the Middle Seer River, forming a defensive screen across the front line. This move stabilized the front, halting the Serbian advance and giving the Austro-Hungarians much-needed breathing room. However, this intervention did not come without costs. Separating a whole army from the Western Front did weaken Germany's position in the West, and would contribute to the stalemate that characterized the war in the West for the next 4 years. Nevertheless, this intervention did allow the Central Powers to stand firm against the Serbs, preventing a complete collapse in the East. But the worst was yet to come for the Serbs, as the Central Powers stood firm. The Russian army advanced into the Balkans to relieve the pressure on their ally. But as the Russians moved into Serbia, they brought with them another threat: disease. To make matters worse, the Serbian people were already suffering greatly. By this point, thousands of refugees had flooded into the cities of Belgrade and Novi Sad, fleeing the war and its attendant atrocities. With the country still reeling from the recent earthquake, Serbia's infrastructure was not able to cope with the sudden influx of people. Food and water were in short supply, and sanitation was non-existent. Disease spread like wildfire through the refugee camps and the cities, causing even more suffering. Adding to the misery of the situation, the retreating Austro-Hungarian army systematically destroyed everything in their path, killing livestock, burning crops and laying mines everywhere. To make matters worse, the Serbian army's chief of staff, General Zivojin Mazic, was a proponent of scorched earth tactics. That is, he believed that the Serbian army should destroy everything in their path in order to deny it to the enemy. This included bridges, roads, and anything else that might be used to facilitate the enemy's advance. However, this policy also meant that the Serbian army was unable to properly supply itself or the civilian population. By the time that the Russians arrived, large parts of the population had already starved to death. Facing this dire situation, the Russians, along with the French and British, set up relief organizations to help the starving Serbs. However, by this point, it was too late. The damage had already been done. Hundreds of thousands of innocent people had died, and the Serbian army was in no shape to continue the fight. In the end, the Serbian nation was saved from destruction only by the Russians, who invaded Serbia and occupied the country, placing it under the control of a military governor. The Serbian army was disbanded and reformed as the Russian Army of Serbia. Under the command of General Lemegentovich, the Serbian army was given a chance to redeem itself and fight on the side of the Allies. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Austro-Hungarian army was withdrawn from the fighting and sent back to Hungary to raise new troops. From this point forward, the Austro-Hungarian army that fought the rest of the war was composed entirely of new recruits. As for the land itself, the area around Sir would remain relatively quiet until the end of the war. The only major engagement that occurred in the region was the Battle of the Sir, fought between the Central Powers and the Russian Army of Serbia in September 1915. However, after the Russian army's defeat at the Battle of Karansebes, any thought of invading Serbia from the north was abandoned, and the Allies instead concentrated on opening a second front in the west through the country of Albania. This campaign, which was led by General Louis Franchet Desprez and General Victor Kohan, failed initially due to logistical difficulties and a lack of cooperation between the Allies. However, it eventually succeeded when the French managed to capture the Albanian capital of Tirana and establish a beachhead on the Adriatic coast. However, this advance was purely a diversion and had little real strategic value. The Central Powers knew this and so allowed the Allies to take the territory without offering serious resistance. Despite this, the occupation of Albania was a costly affair, especially for the French, who suffered heavy casualties from disease and malaria. The French presence in Albania was unpopular with the local population, who resented the foreign invaders and their impact on their country. Eventually, the French would be forced to withdraw from Albania in September 1918, shortly before the armistice of November. So there we have it, a look at the Battle of Sir and its consequences. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. I'd also like to thank our supporters for their continued support. Be sure to check out our social media pages for more updates. Thanks for watching.